Hello, and welcome to another Tech and Tales podcast. I'm your host Abhishek Rao, and today with me I have my co-host Meghana M. Shastri, the WIE chairperson of NISP. Also with us today, we have a very special guest, Rohit Paul. Hey Rohit, how are you?
Hey Abhishek, how you doing?
So, Meghana, do you want to introduce our guest to everyone before we start?
Yes, Abhishek, and thank you for introducing me. Hey everyone, I have a very special guest with us today. I'd like to introduce Rohit Paul. Hi Rohit.
Hi Meghna.
Rohit is a graduate of the Central Saint Martin and is a brand strategist who has worked with multinational organizations in India like Wipro and Howard Business Publishing. He introduced the brand growth strategy and business development processes that have contributed to over 150% growth. He has worked closely with the brilliant Carrie Marks on theatre promotions and graphics, poster campaigns, corporate identity, and bespoke print projects. Wow. So, welcome, Rohit. Thank you for joining us today. So, how are you? How is this pandemic treating you?
I'm doing well. So of course, without kind of belittling just how much suffering the pandemic has caused. So with that being said, I have definitely enjoyed the solitude. So I kind of, I really love simple living. And so during the pandemic, without all the distractions of socializing and everything, it's been wonderful. Like the amount of things I've got to do and improve and grow. So I don't know. I'm loving it. This is my preferred lifestyle. So
For those who don't know, correct me if I'm mistaken, Rohit, but you went and you lived in the wild all by yourself for a couple of weeks when you were when you were working in Flippin, I believe. When I heard you, like when you were speaking in You and I. Correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, that's why I assumed you would like this pandemic because you're isolated and you're all alone.
yeah. So actually, I had I was on a very long. I took 5 years as a kind of long sabbatical where I was traveling around the world. And well, I'm sure we'll get into it in the podcast, but one of the things I wanted to do was to face my fears. And so one of my top fears was being alone. So I actually lived 3 months alone I was about an hour's walk from the nearest town. I mean, there were other, there were lots of other people around um, in the towns and things. But for the most part, I just turned everything off and lived alone. It's when I learned how much I love this.
You guys won't believe it, but Rohit is extremely difficult to get a hold of because he doesn't look at his social media like we all do. So I'm glad you're here today, Rohit. Thank you for making it again.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So before we start, I would like to make an announcement. Since this topic is about mental health, all the views expressed in this podcast are our own personal opinions. And secondly, if you are facing issues with your mental health, please go and consult the nearest specialist in the department. There will be helpline numbers provided in the podcast if you're feeling down.
Yeah, I think that's just really important for us to say. That everyone's unique, everyone's an individual, and if you're really struggling, then you need professional help. That's the best advice that we can give. Everything else that we share here, strategies and things that have worked for us, but professional help is always the best way to go.
Okay. So, Rohit, Khalil Gibran, so he's a very famous poet. He's called the Prophet. So he once quoted in one of his poems, because I like poetry a lot, and then I recently remembered this. He said, "The deeper the sorrow that carves your being, the more joy it contains." So with that being said, how deep of a sorrow is actually depression? What is depression?
Okay, so that's a big, broad question. I do agree with that quote a lot. So, when it comes to depression, anxiety, and all these, they're really the result of something deeper, right? That's the state that we get into. So, one of the things that I remember, before I had experienced it myself, I often thought that people who were depressed were just really sad. That's genuinely what I thought. I just thought they just don't know how to focus their thoughts. They've gotten a bit hopeless, and we need to, if we could just get them to think right and focus right, everything would be okay. And I genuinely thought that, and I was actually in a very long relationship with someone who really struggled with depression. And I just thought, if I can just keep teaching her, I just need to teach her some tools, to change her focus, and then she'll be hopeful and excited. But I was completely wrong, like utterly wrong. There's a big difference between, being sad or even feeling anxiety or depression as a momentary thing. We all go through it. I think the key to remember is that these feelings we have are actually there to protect us. They're defense mechanisms, right? We are evolved to respond to, serious discomfort and terror and fear by having these different emotional processes. And if you did have, say, a loss in the family or something, and you went through a season of literally feeling the same effects of depression, that's one thing. But when you are in that state and you cannot get out for, we're talking months, sometimes years, that's a completely different thing. There's a completely different set of processes that are happening in the brain and with our physiology and emotions that are keeping us there. And that is the state of depression and the state of anxiety. So I don't know if that answered your question, but for me, depression is that state where it's very hard to break out. And how low does it go? Well, that's a subjective question, but I will just say that before my lowest point of depression, if I were to rate my average days before the depression on a scale of 1 to 10, then good days were 7, 8, 9, sometimes 10, right? And a terrible, terrible day where everything seemed to be going wrong was like a 2 or a 1. On the worst day of my depression, I would rate it at about a -6 trillion. I mean, there's just no way to describe how low I went. I thought I was already low, and then I had a complete mental breakdown and fell so far below that it is literally impossible for me to describe it. It is hard for me to go back to that day sometimes. All I have is my recollections. I just remember the extreme pain. But that was the darkest day. We can talk about that more later. But yeah, so, how low can low get? Well, I think it's just literally a bottomless pit. However, just to kind of, sorry, do you want me to keep going? Or? Yeah. Just to kind of put a slightly different perspective on that, was on the day when I literally thought like I had gone through rock bottom and fallen a million miles below that. That actually was my rock bottom. That was the day I literally tried to kill myself because my mind had just broken completely and I lost all sense of reality. However, that was also the turning point for me because there is one place to go from there, and that's up. For the first time, I kind of felt something at the bottom. There was some protection. There was something when I came out of that state that I pushed off of. And every single day since then has been, kind of this upward journey. Of course, it goes like this, but I will never. So going back to that quote, I do not regret. I'm so grateful that I came out of it alive and I didn't lose my life that day. But that being said, I do not regret for a moment that day. In fact, it's one of my favorite, or not favorite, but at least one of my most precious experiences. If it wasn't for that low, the joy and happiness that I experience every single day and the gratefulness to be alive, I would not experience it. So I wouldn't take it back for anything.
Yeah, I'm sure this would help a lot of people here. So my question is, see, sometimes, like most of the times, I can say that Google is the worst possible health advisor. Like, say you try to Google about a simple headache, and a few searches later, you're convinced that you have a brain tumor, something like that. So what basically happens is that you look up a symptom and then you try to relate to it and then end up convincing yourself that you have that symptom. So, similarly, there might be young people who confuse sadness with depression. They go and Google few stuff and convince themselves that they are depressed. So, what advice would you like to give them? Or how do you basically differentiate sadness from depression?
Right. Yeah, good. Thanks for asking that question. Um, well, okay, so I can talk about my experience. My experience was I actually didn't know I was depressed. I kept denying it, even though all the symptoms that you might see were coming out. I was, I'm a very energetic person, normally enthusiastic. At that point, I was on the board of a charity. I was running my own business. I was involved in all these different things, very active socially, and I just started to shut down. I couldn't get out of bed. I lacked energy to do even the most basic things. And I started to oscillate between days of absolute numbness where I felt nothing, and then days when I would just be overwhelmed with worry and guilt and shame. And these are both kind of traits. So anxiety and depression, these are the kind of traits of those states. And I would lose my appetite completely, just be not want to eat for days on end. I got very socially anxious. As someone who was always out in front of people, I've spoken on very large stages with thousands of people, and I couldn't be around people of more than 5 or 6. I would just shut down. I wouldn't know what to say. I would second guess everything I was about to say. I'll never forget, I'd gone to a party with some of my closest friends. There was about maybe 15 people there, and they were all standing in a circle, in the balcony, just having a few drinks and chatting. And I was part of that circle. And at one point, I just was starting to have a panic attack because I just didn't know what to say. I'd been silent the whole night. And at one point, I just took a step back, and someone had just kind of leaned in next to me on the circle, and so blocked me from the circle. And normally, I would just kind of touch them on the shoulder or whatever and step back in, but I just couldn't. I started to step back, and finally I was standing like a foot outside the circle and just completely having a mental breakdown. And I actually just ended up leaving because I just couldn't even do the basic thing. And this was with close friends. So these were some of the symptoms that I was experiencing, But the way that I finally found out that I was depressed was actually with professional help. So I started to, there's a certain point where your brain cannot handle the kind of stress that comes from being in this state. This state is designed to, if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, it's a response to threats, right? So we would have physical threats in the environment. That there was a saber-toothed tiger or whatever, like we were physically about to be hurt. And the body would go into these states of fear in response, right? And these states are draining. I mean, your perception of time changes, right? Each moment feels like an hour. And the reason is the brain is going into this hyper focus to be able to react quickly. So in nature, we're kind of, we're faced with these physical threats, but in the modern day, most of us, for the vast majority of mankind, we're no longer faced with physical threats, but we still have the same lizard brain, And so now it doesn't respond to physical threats. It responds to threats for our psyche. It responds to emotional and mental threats. And so it sees every little threat to our ego. If someone's making fun of us, or we feel humiliated, or we feel like there's too much work for us to do, we feel stressed. It responds in the exact same way. It's the exact same processes, And we're not designed to stay in that process for that long, in that state, that fear state. And when you extend it, it starts to have major ramifications on the body. Your immune system drops. I remember just getting terrible, terrible stomach cramps. You know, no matter what I ate, my body would just not be able to process it, and I would be in agony. And it's because staying in that state is not good for you. Your sleep, I was getting virtually no sleep every night. And so physically as well, the state continues. And when when the stress gets too high, it spills out of your subconscious and into your senses. So I began to see things that weren't actually there. I'd be talking to you, Abhishek, we'd be sitting across the table and they would be spiders and rats and snakes. And I would actually see them crawling on the floor, sometimes on my body. I used to swim a lot back then, like 3 times a week. And I'd get in the water and there'd be sharks in the water with me. I mean, I would feel them. They would come at me. I would, I had to stop driving a car because I kept seeing other vehicles jumping into the road. And so I'd slam my brakes on a blank road. And that actually was, what saved me, because my friends who were in the car with me began to start saying things. My best friend would say, well, you keep like slamming your brakes. And of course, I kept pretending nothing was wrong. But my car kept getting towed because I wasn't able to focus. I parked in front of people's gates. I parked in the middle of the road once. I didn't even realize. And I came back and it was gone. And I just like, what is this? Yeah. And so my friends actually got together. My partner and my best friend got together and they said, look, we need to stay. Something needs to happen because this is not bro. This is not the person we know. And they, got me to find a therapist who specialized. So I was just looking at the problem, right? So the problem was I was hallucinating. I forgot about everything else. I said, okay, that's what I want to fix. And so I called a therapist and went to see her. And I said, look, I'll give you 2 hours. You ask me any questions you want. I'll answer honestly. At the end of the 2 hours, there's only one thing you have to do is just tell me how to fix this. I don't want all of that, come back for multiple sessions. I'm not one of those people. I just need one session. You just tell me what to do. I'll do it. I'll be fine, And for 2 hours, she listened to me. At the end of 2 hours, I said, all right, we've got like 5 minutes left. Like, give it to me. What's the verdict? And she starts this usual, like, hey, listen, you need to come back. We need to do some work here. And I was like, forget it. I literally got out of my chair. I was walking to the door. I was like, her name is Rochelle. I was like, thank you very much, but no, I'm not going to do it. Like, either you tell me. So she said, wait, like, do you want me to tell you straight? And I said, yes, always the truth. I want it straight. And she said, Ro, it's really obvious to me you're clinically depressed. And that was just the last thing that I expected. I was just like, I remember even just kind of smiling and being like, what are you talking about? Like, I've launched this incredible American company here in India. It's my second. I'm like successful, and I'm doing so much and involved in so much. Like depression. Who has time for depression? Like it's nuts. And she literally opened. She had a journal of psychology on her. She opened it and went. There was a checklist, and she said, "Look, let's go through everything you've said in the last 2 hours. I can." And she said, "You tell me." I went through in every single criteria I could put a tick mark next. And still I was not convinced. I argued with her. The only reason I think I went back to the next day, in fact, I took a long time to go back because I just wasn't convinced. But she was right. Before I left, she said, look, if you don't get help, it's going to get worse. And that's exactly what happened. It just got so much worse. And 6 months later, I went back and just in tears, and I just said, I need help. So for me, it was, with professional diagnosis. I will say this, for those of you who are listening, am I just sad? We can look at, okay, what's going on in your life? Are there some events that have happened that have put you in this, right? That's natural. That's normal. That's your body's way. I was just listening to a podcast today where they were talking about how when a loved one dies, it was actually part of our evolutionary programming to feel really, really detached and to feel really sad because that helped us to distance ourselves from the body. If you stayed near the body, it was dangerous, right? As the body starts to decay. So for our ancestors, there's a psychological reason, there's an evolutionary reason for us to distance and feel that loss and misery, So it's there to protect you. So if there's an event, then give yourself some space, right? Give yourself some grace. Talk to other people. It's been the biggest tip in the world. Talk to other people if you're feeling down. However, if it continues and it continues, then my strongest recommendation is to go and get help. Even if you aren't depressed, even if you aren't in a state, all of us could use therapy. Like, I then went on to see my therapist for years. Even now, once in 6 months, I'll check in with her. And it was easily one of the core things that saved my life. And I would just strongly recommend anyone who's on the fence, make an appointment, get a recommendation, talk to someone. Now it's just virtual, right? So you don't have to even go, but virtually you can see a therapist, and get that diagnosis. So yeah, I wouldn't rely on Google, although I think it gives you like good clues, right? Like, you can listen to other people's experiences, YouTube and so on. It gives you clues. But before you kind of make up your mind and go into that, get professional help.
Well, I'm glad you brought this up, because there are two things I can further ask you upon this. One, you said, I believe, I don't have time for a therapist. So my first question is, with that being said, do you think that is the cause that depression has increased throughout this pandemic, or are there other reasons also? And my second question would be, which is completely unrelated, is how you said you were so against going to a therapist initially, and then you needed a lot of convincing. In India, particularly, physical health care gets a lot more attention than mental health care. So what are your thoughts about that? And where does the fault lie in the system? Because is it being cultivated from from a young age, or is it the general mentality of the society? How do you break through this? Because there's this typical stereotypism when it is associated with mental health. So these are the two questions I would like to ask you.
So in terms of the root cause, or why we kind of resist therapy so much, I'll start with that one. I do think it is culturally such a taboo, right? And it's not just India. I mean, it's all over the world. We are taught to project this image that I've got it all together. It's part of, and I think it's actually very strong for us as Indians, because there's such beautiful things about our culture, and that we care so much about society. We care about our families. We care about community, and we have been almost kind of groomed that we should care more about others than we care about ourselves. We should put their needs first. Again, that's beautiful, and I know we're respected around the world for it, but it has these consequences. That when we are really struggling, we're hiding. So often we're hiding, and that has massive ramifications. I mean, you've got to just kind of step back and think for a second what it means to be a young person just growing up in India. We're a culture in flux. Never before have we had so much access to all the other cultures and information for the rest of the world. I mean, when I was growing up, the internet was literally just being invented, so we didn't grow up with it. And when it did come in, it created such a huge contrast between the generations. Suddenly, you had this very traditional Indian environment, and suddenly, bam, you've got all these outside influences, and for many of us, we're struggling with that. Even if that wasn't the case, just life in general, coming to terms with, at the risk of sounding like someone who's anti-technology, and I'm not, there's just so much more that our brains are dealing with, right? I just pick up my phone, and in a few seconds, I can see all these other people and their perfect, beautiful Instagram lives, right? I got so much to compare myself to. I've got so many reasons why I can look at myself and think, oh man, I'm not, this is wrong with me, that is wrong with me, this is wrong with me, that is wrong with me. Just on a personal note, I'll never forget when I began to realize that there was some part of me that was secretly kind of almost ashamed of being Indian, that there was some part of me that, I don't mean like in terms of being Indian as a culture, but I mean like, okay, think about this. So I grew up in an English-speaking family, right? We always watched Hollywood. That, we didn't really watch Indian cinema because my mom's Anglo-Indian. We've always spoken English our whole life. And so every single hero that I ever saw was white, normally blue eyes and blonde, right? And lived a certain lifestyle, dressed a certain way, completely separate from my Indian upbringing, right? And on some level, on some subconscious level, I think I try to model myself after that. You see, all your heroes are like these white, driving cars in New York or whatever, and then you're comparing it to your life. And on some subtle level, I was taking that in. Now, just even if you take that simple thing, that's something that I had to deal with. When I realized it, I had to look and realize that on some subtle level, I was trying to be something I was not. Why didn't I love? I kept a journal since I was 16, and so one of the things I do is I'll go back like 6 years and read that journal. And I'll never forget one time when I first went backpacking. Right, I was traveling by myself with a little backpack and somewhere in the world. And I remember in that journal, I think it was Cambodia, and in the journal I was meeting people from all over the world. And I remember there was a line in that journal, and it said something like, I can't remember what it was. Like, I think I had gotten a pimple or something in the center of my forehead, and so it looked like a bindi or something. It made me look really Indian. And I remember writing and just being like, oh, I hate this pimple. I hate that it makes me look so Indian. Now I read that and I'm like, what? I love being Indian, but then that was something I had to deal with, right? Now that's a small issue, but we can take much more serious issues that many of us have gone through. I mean, for our women in India, we all know the statistics, right? Most of our young women have had some experience. Again, not just, I don't want to put a blanketing statement across India, but many of our women have had those inappropriate experiences, and that is not something to be swept under the rug. I have dated people who have been through, abuse, rape, and now as adults they are facing the consequences, but their own parents, who they finally, after many, many years, opened up and told them, oh, you're fine now. You're fine now. I'm sorry that happened to you, but you're fine now. Let's sweep it under the rug. Sweep it under the rug. I'm coaching someone who literally went through had a sexual experience with a family member, and they both found themselves in the situation. It happened, and now they're trying to deal with it. They're devastated as they come out of this thing, and all the adults, all of them, are telling them, shh, don't talk about it. Sweep it. Like, did anything? No, nothing bad. No one's hurt. Like, stop. Don't talk. Don't talk. And literally their own. And it's devastating. The guy I'm talking to, like, he is drinking himself to death. He's from the first thing in the morning till the last thing at night. He's getting arrested. Like, it's getting really, really bad. And so, our parents and our parents' generation, they in a lot of ways they were really strong about this stuff. They kind of just buried it and got on with it, right? However, that does, even though they grew up in a different way and they're not exposed to all the ways of sharing your life as we are and all the expression, still, in conferring with a lot of my friends, just the other day we were sitting down to dinner, we were chatting about this, and part of people in my bubble, and they're talking about how their grandparents, as they're getting older, all the things they kept inside are now coming out. And they're starting to, their mind is starting to break up a little bit. They're starting to say all their resentments about this uncle and that. And it's like, for us, it's shocking, these are our grandparents who kept everything perfect inside, and now it's coming out. So, yeah, as a society, if we don't change this, with all the effects of the modern life, we're going to see major, major problems. Now, the second question about why the pandemic is bringing it out even more. So when I first went through depression, I did a lot of research and began to read into it and things like that. And as I began to, Abhishek, we've lost you. No, there you go. Yeah. So, as I began to research, I'll never forget this one article I came across, which was on geriatric depression. So it was about depression after you retire. Now, the research they were using, it was all about the research that was behind this article was mainly from the West. Okay, so I don't know what the statistics are for us as Indians. But this book was looking at how 9 out of every 10 people that retire struggle with depression. Just think about that. It's in the geriatric depression is in the 90th percentile. Now, what that means is that most people, when they retire, go through depression. And this book was, so basically this guy works with geriatric, and he was trying to, expose some light on this for the rest of us, because we're all getting there, And what he was saying is two things. One is that most of them will never talk about it. And the reason they'll never talk about it is because as it is, they feel like they're a burden on the other people in their lives. Yeah, the young people who are coming to see them, say at their homes, or, even just, and so they don't want anyone to pity them. They don't talk about how they're feeling miserable. They keep it all to themselves. And that's why it's such, bless you, that's why it's such a, problematic thing, because it's all kept so secret. But the second thing is that he said that, most of us, for most of our lives, keep all of the fears, the emotions, the narratives, the deep, dark demons at bay by staying busy. Now, we don't just do it in the kind of the ways that we talk about as unhealthy, of like career driven or seeking power and money and fame and all that. We also do it in more subtle ways, like, for example, constantly being around people, never being alone. We always want to be with our families, always want to be surrounded by entertainment. And our generation, or even your generation, just a separate generation from mine, is even worse, because, we don't take our headphones off. We're always into music, podcasts, or videos. We're watching things, there's always that, and we pull out our phones. And these things are keeping the fears and the anxiety and all at bay. They're burying them deep down inside. And at some point, all of us are going to end up on that couch after we retire. Now suddenly you've got no job. Most of the time, your family members are not around. They've got their own lives. Maybe you lose your spouse. And suddenly, for the first time in your life, you've got no defense. There's only so much TV you can watch. And those thoughts start to creep in. What most people don't realize, at the end of your life, when your mind starts to break down, people think you lose your memories. That's not actually true. As you lose some memories, other memories become as vivid as if they happened yesterday. So something you've not thought about your whole life when you were 12 years old, you can suddenly relive it in vivid detail. The problem is whenever you relive a memory, you're not actually seeing what happened. You're seeing your interpretation of what happened based on the state you are in now. And since they're anyways depressed, they go back and revisit memories with a whole different lens. And that leads to very severe depression. Now, the reason I'm telling you all this is because that's what I was going through in my depression. It just happened earlier. I was reliving my memories through the state of depression. That's why I literally came to the point of suicide, because I started seeing my best friends growing up. They didn't really see me as a friend, because I was seeing it through the state of depression. I started seeing myself as the worst person in the group. I was the guy that everyone tolerated. They didn't actually like me. Yeah. I don't want to swear, but the what of the group. They didn't actually love me. They just thought, oh, well, no one else is going to be his friend, so let's, and this is what I was seeing in my mind's eye. My best friends weren't really my best friends. They just felt sorry for me. My family was not really trying to support me. They were just miserable, because they all just wanted me to be happy, and I was destroying their lives. And I became convinced that I was the root of the evil and the suffering in their lives. And if I really, truly loved them, that I should kill myself and stop their suffering. That's where the disease part comes in, right? And so when I read this book, I remember thinking, okay, so I'm coming through the depression. I'm working through it with therapy and all of that. I'm learning. But I don't want to go through this again. I don't want to. I was having what's called a quarter life crisis, right? Because I was pretty young back then. But I don't want to go visit this again in a midlife crisis, and then again after I retire. And that prompted me to do some of the things I did, like one of the experiments I told you about, going and living alone. I was terrified. I was terrified of doing it as someone who had had depression in the past, as someone who was mostly extroverted and loves being around people and gets my energy from people. The idea of being alone without any distractions, no devices, no internet, in the middle of nowhere was terrifying. But I just thought, I can't practice that now. I'm going to face it later. And what the pandemic has done is it's put us in these situations, whether we like it or not. For the first time, all the distractions of getting out of the house and escaping from your relationship issues, or if you live alone, escaping from your thoughts into friends, into work, into, suddenly they're just, all those options are limited. And suddenly you've got a very small amount of things that you can do, to stay distracted. And these thoughts and these fears and these emotions and the things that we've repressed are creeping in, and they can be overwhelming. The reason why I said it was a minus, whatever 6 trillion, is because on that day when I had that breakdown, because my mind went through a breakdown, whatever little defenses I had were gone. And for the first time in my life, I saw the depth of my fears. And I literally, later, with my therapist, we filled and full of all the thoughts I had. And I never knew how much I hated everything about myself. I basically had no hope for the future, because how could I? I was such a wretched being, and I hated everything. And subtly, these thoughts are these insecurities, these feelings, these narratives about how we're not good enough. They're there inside us, but we've learned to mitigate them. But when you get fully silent and you stop the distractions, they come forward. Now, the good news is we can learn tools. When you become aware of these things, there are things we can do. There's other tools that we can use to help us to learn compassion and learn to accept our humanity and be able to embrace the challenges and so on. But the problem with a society that denies it and doesn't want to talk about it is, where do we learn these tools? Where was this curriculum in school, in college? Why didn't people, why wasn't there subject about emotional well-being, relational well-being, mental well-being? We never covered these things. And the sad part is that for many of us, we're having to learn them after the breakdown, and so while I do think the pandemic is caused so much pain and strife and challenge, I think it's also a huge opportunity. It's a huge wake-up call. For a lot of people, I think they're starting to realize, I got to take this more seriously. My mental well-being, my emotional state. I can't just sweep it under the rug.
So that's all, folks, for part 1 of the mental health special of the Tech and Tales podcast. Please feel free to tune in next week for part 2. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.